I have, my dad knows this, I have a headache I've been battling. When I have a headache, I get either my head gets really foggy or I get an obnoxious kind of mood going on, and it's that one right now. So I'm going to try to not be, but I keep thinking of things to say and keep thinking, no, I should not say that. So pray for me this evening. That would be good. Genesis chapter 1, we're going to start reading in verse 1. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters, and God said, let there be light, and there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good, and God divided the light from the darkness, and God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And the evening and the morning were the first day. And God said, let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters. And God made the firmament, and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament, and it was so. And God called the firmament heaven, and the evening and the morning were the second day. And as we know, it continues on. We'll stop there for right now. We'll kind of jump around a little bit as we go in the message, but for right now, we will stop and let's have a word of prayer. Lord, I want to thank you for this evening, Lord. I thank you for the privilege that we have to meet and to be in your house tonight, Lord. I do pray that you will speak through me tonight, Lord, and that you will just use this time, Lord. I pray this in your name. Amen. You can go ahead and be seated. So this passage and the creation, the Garden of Eden and all of that is extremely familiar to us. If you spent time in church at all, you've heard it read, you've read it yourself, maybe you've been taught it in Sunday school classes. For a lot of you in here that teach Sunday school classes, you've taught it before. But I want to try to, I think, maybe turn the focus a little bit, because here's what we often do, and not just regarding this passage, but when we look at our Bible, very often we see the people. We read our Bible and we focus on men. We look at the Garden of Eden, and what do we most often talk about? Adam and Eve. There are so many different areas of creation that could be the focus. There are so many different areas of the garden itself that could be what we focus on, but we often want to focus on the creation of Adam and Eve and on what they did in the garden. Or we look in our Bible at things like the flood, and what do we see? We refer to it as Noah's Ark. Wouldn't it make more sense to be called God's flood? I mean, I don't mean to take anything away from Noah. God speaks very highly of him in the Bible, and the faith that he showed is nothing short of amazing, but God led him, and God gave him the blueprints for the ark, and God sent the animals, and God sent the flood, and God protected them, and God brought them through it, and yet we refer to it as Noah's Ark, because as a man, we tend to see what people did. We look at David and Goliath, and what do we see? David, the little shepherd boy and his sling, and we focus on David and the lion and the bear, and we focus on the army that is cowering before Goliath, and David having the faith to walk out, and we focus on the conversation with David and Saul, and then we focus on the conversation of David and Goliath, and I could continue on with examples, but we look at these different things in the Bible all the way through it, and what we notice more often than not is what people did. And it's natural, because after all, we are people. My hope with this message this evening, I want to try to look at this passage and not see what man did. Not focus on what some person did, not putting our attention on their actions, but instead focusing on God with the idea of this. And I'm using this because it is the very beginning. This is the creation, so I'm using this passage, but I want to do this with the idea of helping us to see God in everything, because he is. Whether we are focused on man's actions or not, we look at our Bible, God's in every page of it, and more than just in our Bible. Because the reality is we do exactly that same thing in our life. we tend to lose sight of God. He's working in our lives, and he's working around us every single day, but more often than not, we miss it. We are focused on someone else, on what they are doing, and maybe the successes that they are seeing, or we're focused on what someone else is saying, or maybe how someone else is treating us, but we're focused on someone. The focus shouldn't be on them, but on God. Often we miss what God's doing because we're focused on someone. Often we miss what God's doing because we're focused on ourselves. Whether it's successes or failures, we are so focused on me that we fail to see Him. The reality is, it's not about me. All that said kind of brings us to the message tonight. Genesis 1:1, it says, in the beginning, God. He starts our focus off right. Not in the beginning, creation. Not in the beginning, the angels. Not in the beginning, man. Not in the beginning, anything else. In the beginning, God. It's as if God's trying to set the precedence and the focus right at the start. Because it's the theme that we see throughout, especially Genesis chapter 1. Verse 1, in the beginning God. Verse 3, and God said. Verse 4, and God saw. Verse 5, and God called. Verse 6, and God said. Verse 7, and God made. Verse 8, and God called. Verse 9, and God said. Verse 10, and God called. On and on and on we could go. I have them all listed out here, and I'm not going to read all of them to you, but it goes all the way through. There's a theme there. Resounding theme over and over is not in the beginning Adam and Eve. It's in the beginning God. God in everything. And tonight's message, again, what I want us to see is that creation and the Garden of Eden is not the story of Adam and Eve and the start of mankind. They were a part of it, yes, but they were just a part of God's creation. It's not even the story of the fall of man. Again, that's something that plays a big role, but that's not our focus, or at least that shouldn't be what we focus on. The focus is God in everything. I have three areas that I want us to try and focus on a little bit in this creation and Garden of Eden time frame, and focus on God. The first is simply that, God in creation. I just read a little bit of Genesis chapter 1. I think I read the first 8 verses. I gave a few more from there. I'm not going to have us go through all that again, but there were a few words. I'm going to have to read that whole list, or it's not going to make sense. Okay, bear with me, because I'm going to read all of my list of and gods, because otherwise my next point is going to be confusing. All right, in the beginning, God. God said, and God saw, and God called, and God said, and God made, and God called, and God said, and God called, and God said, and God said, and God made, and God set, and God said, and God created, and God blessed. Hold on, I need a breath. And God said, and God made, and God made, and God created, and God blessed, and God said, and God saw. Did you catch all those? There's a few words in there that were repeated over and over again. God created. I put these two together. God created and God made. I find it interesting. Maybe this is just me. There's very little focus put on what He made. Maybe a verse or two at the most. Think about it. You're talking things like all the continents of the earth were summed up in just 2 verses. And the creation of that was summed up in just 2 verses. In that, you're going to have the wonders of the world and the vastness of this planet all summed up in verse or in those 2 verses. You have things like verse 9, God said, let the waters under heaven be gathered together unto one place, and let the dry land appear, and it was so. So you're talking one verse, and it covers all of that area. Or you get to the 5th day when He created everything that lives in the water and in the air. Again, the only mention is a couple of verses, because the focus was not to be on the whales. I mean, you think about it, scientists try to always be discovering new things in the ocean and all that. They have discovered some really insane-looking creatures in the ocean. I mean, some of the things that there are, especially when you get down super deep where it's dark and they, are exploring those areas, some of the creatures they find in the water are just downright terrifying. God could have spent all sorts of time in creation explaining these crazy critters he put in the water. But he didn't. He spent a couple of verses because the weird things in the darkness of the ocean wasn't the focus. Not where he wanted our attention to be. The focus wasn't supposed to be on the mountains and the rivers or the waterfalls or the animals or the plants or the trees. The focus was meant to be that God created it, that he spoke and it happened. The first word we see repeated was that God created or God made. The second that I want to see, God saw. For God to see, that meant he was paying attention. He was engaged in what was going on. I'm sure all of us in here can relate to this, that we've done something like this, that you are doing something, but you're not really paying attention to what you're doing. Maybe something else is distracting you, or you have your mind on something else, and so you aren't really focused on what's happening around you, and it gets done, and you realize, oh, hey, I messed up. Just yesterday, I was, might not have been yesterday, Friday, a couple days ago, I was texting 3 different people at once, which I typically can do as long as it's a fairly light conversation. One of the conversations started to get somewhat intense, not in a bad way, but, requiring that I put some thought into it, and I was doing all this while I was pumping gas and very nearly filled my diesel truck with regular gas. I had the pump in it and was about to pull the handle when all of a sudden I realized this isn't green. There's something wrong here. Thankfully, I realized it. I was doing something, but I wasn't really engaged in what I was doing. I was distracted. That wasn't the case when God created everything. It's not like he was, he's creating things, but he's not really engaged in it. Think about this. It wasn't as if God is just bored, so he decided to make a planet. I've heard some who have tried to, I don't know if argue that is the right way to put it, but have tried to claim that well, what did God do before the creation? You have endless time, and God just was, so there just came a point that I had a guy argue this with me, that God was just bored and needed something to put his attention on. So he decided, hey, let's make a planet. Now, he had a purpose and a plan, and in that, a very specific way that he did it. He was focused. He was engaged. He was watching. He saw. The third word I see repeated in these verses is that God blessed it. God blessed. He cared. There are some who believe that God created the world and everything in it, and he kind of set it to spinning and then just walked away. I'm going to make this thing, and I'm going to kind of just set it on its course and then just walk away, not really interested in what the outcome was, not really going to get involved in his creation, just make it, set it in motion, and see what happens. In essence, saying, God blessing it here in Genesis 1 is no more than God creating it and saying, good luck, as he walks away. But that isn't what we see. He cared about his creation. And not just man. You read Genesis 1, man wasn't the only thing that he blessed. He wants the best for his creation. I think it's pretty easy for us. We can look at that and we can see how many times God is mentioned. We can clearly see God in creation. The Bible leaves very little doubt of it. The second thing I want us to see tonight is God in the fall. Turn over to Genesis chapter 3 with me. Like I said, I'm going to have us kind of jump around a little bit. Genesis chapter 3, God in the fall, and I know that sounds maybe a little odd, but follow me on this. Genesis 3, starting in verse 1, now the serpent was more subtle than any beast of the field which the Lord God had made, and he said unto the woman, Yea, hath God said, Ye shall not eat of every tree of the garden? And the woman said unto the serpent, We may eat of the fruit of the trees of the garden, but of the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, God hath said, Ye shall not eat of it, neither shall ye touch it, lest ye die. And the serpent said unto the woman, Ye shall not surely die. For God doth know that in the day ye eat thereof, then your eyes shall be opened, and ye shall be as gods, knowing good and evil. And when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was pleasant to the eyes, and a tree to be desired to make one wise, she took of the fruit thereof, and did eat, and gave also unto her husband with her, and he did eat. And the eyes of them both were opened, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together, and made themselves aprons. Now, God in the fall. Notice this with me. When Satan, what Satan uses to deceive Eve was God. He starts off by questioning God. Hath God said? Are you sure that's what God really meant? Which is, it's something we hear a lot. Well, I know what the Bible said, but is that really what God meant? Or another that you hear often is, I know it's in the Bible, but are you sure that applies to me? But the reason Satan uses that approach was that he understands the position that God holds. He understands that with the relationship that Adam and Eve had with God in the garden, the only way that he could deceive her was to first get her to question God. You think about it, every day Adam and Eve walked with God. For her to believe Satan's lie, she's going to have to start questioning God, or otherwise she's going to have opportunity to talk to him about it. Where Satan starts off is by questioning God. Then he moves to, once we start getting her to question God, he moves to, well, what God knows. And again, Satan knows that Eve respects God, so he attacks from that point. God knows what will happen when you eat this, and then he takes that next step of, well, you'll be like God. And who wouldn't want to be like God? Satan realized something that many people don't, and that is that the focus, Satan realized, the focus is to be on God. So we use that to twist and deceive Eve. The focus is supposed to be like God. Hey, you eat this, you can be like him. If God was the focus of creation, God was the focus of fall, and then thirdly this evening, God in the plan. Again, chapter 3, skip down to verse 14 and 15 with me, if you will. Lord God said unto the serpent, Because thou hast done this, thou art cursed above all cattle, and above every beast of the field. Upon thy belly shalt thou go, and dust shalt thou eat all the days of thy life. And I will put enmity between thee and the woman, and between thy seed and her seed, and it shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel. Again, a familiar passage. The first time that we hear God's plan for salvation, and I've always found this an interesting thing, that the first time we hear God's plan for salvation, he's explaining it to Satan. It's not a, he's explaining it to man, and it's not a, he's, is sitting Adam and Eve down and saying, hey, here's what happened, and because of it, sin has now entered into the world, so, here's what my plan is. No, the first time is he's explaining it to Satan, that here's what's going to happen, which I don't know, I just kind of, I love the fact it's almost like he's putting Satan on warning. And just so you know, I know you think you got away with something here. Here's my plan the whole time. Here's what's going to happen. But you look at that. God's plan was his son. God's plan was God. He didn't leave it to man to figure out on his own. He didn't tell Adam that he better, Adam, you messed up. You and Eve messed up, so you better figure out something to to appease my anger. God didn't even say, well, someday some person will find a way to make up for what you did. You know, you messed up, and now there's this whole mess because of it, so if you can't figure it out, someone somewhere is going to have to figure out a way to atone for what you did. No, God says, you've sinned, I'll take care of this. Once again, making it so the focus was not on man. It wasn't on what we can do, but instead it was on what he has done. Remember, the Bible says not of works of righteousness. The reason that we so often struggle with that and think it has to be about my works and what I do and what I can accomplish is because we are so man-focused and have a hard time recognizing that the focus needs to be on God. Not of works of righteousness is just another reminder, hey, the focus is on him. You look at Genesis 1, chapter 1 through 3, really, and there are so many things that could be focused on. You could, start going down the list. A person could focus on, well, what was God doing before he created? Before Genesis 1:1, what was he doing? I've heard people spend countless hours trying to figure out what God did for all the time there was before time, as if for some reason that mattered. I always thought it was funny when my dad worked for the Bible college. I loved to go in the guys' dorms just to listen to them argue about really pointless stuff, because they would sit for hours and argue, well, what did God do before there was time? What does it matter? A person could focus on, the creation, the different things that God made. And again, people do focus on that. Basically, everything on the list of things created, and even the subcategories of those things that God created, people will devote their life to studying. I mentioned the sea life. God spent like one verse talking about the sea life, and I looked it up. There has been a such thing as a marine biologist since 1200 BC. God spent one verse saying, I created everything in the water. We've spent since 1200 BC trying to figure out what all that entails. I mean, people spend their entire lifetime studying the creation rather than the creator. A person, and I'm not, don't get me wrong, as I'm not saying, it's evil to be a marine biologist or something like that, or to study those things. I'm saying God's focus wasn't on what he created. It ought to be on him. A person could focus on the fall itself. Well, why was Eve deceived, and why did Adam, knowing it was wrong, follow his wife's lead, and why would, or what would have happened if Adam and Eve wouldn't have sinned? Maybe I've heard people talk about, would we still be in the garden today, or would someone between now and then have sinned? A person could focus on all sorts of different things, and people do. They allow those things to become a distraction when the reality is the focus is God. I don't think there is anything wrong with studying any of those other things. I think there is something wrong when that becomes our God instead of God. And often that's what it becomes. Again, mention the marine biologist thing, or my brain is blank right now, whatever the study of plants is called. Somebody. Nobody's going to help me. Okay. Biology, thank you. I knew someone knew the answer, but no one was saying anything. But with those things so often become where that becomes the God and our focus, rather than the one who made those things. We allow all that to become a distraction when the reality, the focus, is God. So here's where I want to bring this message this evening, kind of apply this to us. I told you, I want to look at this in the idea of, and using creation as the example, but seeing God in everything. Because it is so easy to be distracted by all those things. So here's my question. Where is your focus? What's your attention on? When you look at your life, not looking at someone else, when you look at your life, what do you see? Do you see I raised and I worked and I made and I did and I this and I that, or even maybe I went through this or I handled that? Or do you see God saved and God changed and God worked and God gave and God? If the focus of your life is on you, then you're looking in the wrong place. If the focus of your life is on the things that I want and the things that I'm going to accomplish, or the things that I have gone through, or look at what I have done, then your eyes are in the wrong place. The songwriter says, "Turn your eyes upon Jesus, look full in his wonderful face." Here's what I want to challenge this evening. Let's turn our eyes and our focus off of, I'll use myself, turn our eyes and our focus off of me, off of what I want, what I need, what I think, off of us, and on to God. Stop focusing on the creation, and start focusing on the Creator. Let's pray. Lord, I want to pray that you'll help us. Lord, simply put, Lord, help us to turn our eyes upon you. It is so often that our focus is on self. It's so often that our focus is on I, is on what I've done or what I've accomplished or what I'm going to do or where I want to go, rather than on you. Lord, I pray that you will, Lord, help us as a child of God. Lord, help my focus to not be on I, but to be on God saved and God changed and God worked and God gave. My focus would be on you, not on I. It's in your name.
Ask God to search our hearts and speak to us. Take that message, the focus